Okay, everybody. Well, first of all, thank you all very, very much indeed for coming along, and I'm really grateful to Richard for having provided the opportunity to give this presentation here this afternoon. I'll be sort of introducing some of my own work in the course of this talk, so I won't really try and say anything more about myself before then, except I'm at Cardiff University. I've come down from South Wales this morning. It was considerably colder in South Wales, by the way, 1 degree as I came past Newport, I noticed on the car dashboard. But I'm going to be talking, as Richard's already said, about work that I've been involved in looking at the Anglo-Saxon burial record in archaeology. It's work that I did as part of a big project along with many other colleagues, but it's work which led me to realise, as soon as I read actually in Current Archaeology about 2 years ago about the Barrow Clump excavation, that not only was this new information that was being excavated, new finds that were being excavated that would fit in perfectly with the sort of things we'd been doing, and indeed, as I'll say towards the end of what I've got to present this afternoon, could very well help us to answer a key question there. But also it was immediately apparent to me that having gone into various techniques as a complete duffer to start with, I realised that actually it is possible to learn how to do an awful lot of things, and this would be, in my view, a really ideal project, that if there were people who've been involved in the excavations of these sites, want to go on with some of the post-excavation, look at how you process, how you interpret and understand the material that comes out of these sites to take it further. And indeed, the amount that we can do there is, to say it's almost infinite sounds exaggerating, but really I can see all sorts of further things that we could do, and I'm very interested indeed, after what I've presented by way of introduction, to be talking to you, discussing with you very seriously if anybody's interested in taking this further, and what would be the practical ways of actually doing that. Now, I'm going to apologise to those people who already know this, but there's some things that I think it's probably going to be easiest if we come in with some really basic stuff to start with, and that's just to sort of give us an idea about the Anglo-Saxon period, and in particular the Early Anglo-Saxon period. It's sort of quite neat in that we can just look at the 2,000 years from the year 1 up until the beginning of the 21st century, and say, right, the first 400 years of that's the Roman period, and that's what we're only interested in because it's what's before what we're actually interested in here today. Romans come in the 1st century AD, leave early in the 5th century. Quite interestingly, there's a historical source, a text called the Rescript, which means the answering letter, basically, by the Emperor Honorius, where he effectively puts Britain outside the Roman Empire. What he says to the rulers, to the people who are in charge in Britain, is you've got to organise your own defence. Now, under the Roman system, nobody was allowed to bear arms other than the troops of the empire. And when he says to the cities of Britain, you've got to organise your own, so he says, arm yourselves, look after yourselves as best you can. You're not subject to Roman law anymore. And that was the end of the Roman Empire in Britain. Over the next half century, we know that there is a big change in Britain, a big change in the way that people lived, even eventually a big change in the language that people spoke, which is it all moves over to what we call a Germanic culture. Practices, material practices and language come in from the continent, from northern Germany, southern Scandinavia, and this is what we call the beginning of the Anglo-Saxon period. They were Angles and Saxons who came in. There has been decades of pointless argument over whether there were just a few Saxons who were very, very powerful and influential, or huge numbers of them who swept all the poor Romano-British natives out of the way. We're not interested in that question here. They arrived, their way of doing things arrived. And one of the most interesting and important to us points about this is this early Anglo-Saxon period. The Romans are very visible because they have villas, they have towns, they have military camps, they have lovely straight roads going across the landscape. What the Anglo-Saxons, and particularly the early Anglo-Saxons, had was dead people who were put in the ground along with a lot of objects. The burial rites that we've got from the early Anglo-Saxons make this period extremely visible to the archaeologist. We've got records going back to the 17th century of cremation urns having been found. They weren't at that time identified as Anglo-Saxon, but they're drawn. We know what they are. In other cases, we have inhumation graves there, and it's inhumations I'm going to be focusing on primarily here. And those inhumation graves can themselves be producing an awful lot of material. So if a farmer is ploughing a piece of land, or they were digging to build a railway in the 19th century or something like that, if they went through an early Anglo-Saxon cemetery, they would usually know about it. Believe me, it is possible to go through human bones without particularly recognising them. But when, you know, a sword, big hoops from an iron-bound bucket, or, you know, huge numbers of brooches and so on come up, they tend to be seen. And so we've got a lot of records of Anglo-Saxon graves having been found. The numbers are certainly in the tens of thousands. Now, as I said, I'm going to be focusing on the inhumation graves here, and most of the ones that have come up in Wessex are inhumation. Broadly, we can say that cremation is more common earlier on so let's say there's more 5th and early 6th century cremations, and there tends to be a shift over to inhumation, but it's very much a sliding scale of change there. Male grave goods are very distinctly different from female grave goods. This was a society that had an extremely clear view of the difference between the two sexes. There's been one or two people who've tried to be very politically correct and said we can't impose our views on the past. Well, we don't have to. They had their own views that were extremely clear in these respects. Characteristic male grave goods, exceptional grave here from RAF Lake and Heath, which I've been working on, and Richard has done a lot with too. The man here, what he's got lying alongside him here is his sword. It's coming up on his left-hand side, up by the waist. That's the way it would have been worn. He's got a spear here on his right-hand side, for the right hand to be throwing at his. Interestingly, across his chest, that's the boss of a shield that was placed on his chest. You know, this is very much dressed, as it were, you know, in all his equipment in that way. We've even got here at Lake and Heath, this isn't an example of it, we've got examples where we've got men in the grave with one arm turned up behind the shield, literally as if he was holding it in the grave. Interestingly, we've got one left-hander there where he's got his left arm turned up behind the shield as well. This fellow too, big tub there and a horse there. This is what we tend to see in the illustrations of these, the type of shield boss that can turn up a big one-edged sort of dagger or sword. They're not a weapon in this case, just a knife involved there too. And for women, for the female graves, the focus is very, very much more on the costume that the women were wearing. A lot of brooches. If you look very carefully on this, you can actually see where the brooches are on the costume there. Can be quite a large number of brooches, quite a large number of beads, other things around the costume as well turn up there, and you know from these you can actually reconstruct in some detail how these women were dressed. Very, very few dress accessories come up in male graves. Time we get to the 7th century, men are showing off rather showy buckles in their costume, and women tend not to be wearing buckles at that time, but that's more or less all we actually get from the male graves as far as the scope for reconstructing the costume goes. Okay, so what do we do with all of this evidence that we've got there? You know, put down here, what do we infer from the Anglo-Saxon burials? Well, one thing we can study is we can look at the changing status and experiences through the lifestyle. Osteologists can look at the bodies that we've got in the day. They can give us age at death pretty accurately to within about 10 years once you're into the adult range. Up to the age of 18, you can usually do it more or less to a year as to how old the individual was at death. We know that to pass your 40th birthday made you unusual and old in this particular population. The absolute mean life expectancy was somewhere between 20 and 25, but that's a very, very misleading figure. There's very high child and juvenile mortality. If you got into your 20s, you had a more than even chance of making it through to your mid-30s, but once you'd got past your mid-30s, the odds were against you living another decade. Though we do have people going up to 60. Historically, we know of people living to 80 and 90 as well. But what we can do is look at how these different age groups are treated in burial. We can look at the pathology on the skeletons and find out a lot about how people experience. It's very clear to us how children are gradually brought in to an adult range of experiences and range of treatment. That's hardly surprising. Those who are dying between around about the very, very late teens, 19, 20, through to 35, are the ones who are getting the maximum amount of material on the hold going into the grave with them. And as you move away from that, as you move into these older categories, it appears there that if we can just go from the wealth in the grave to your status in the community, you are actually slowly losing that status. And certainly by the time you get to the very old, they do look to have been sort of pushed beyond the elder category to the retired elder. There are actually wonderful stories. There's an Arabic writer in the medieval period who got to the age of 90 and recorded his experiences of being an absolute outcast within society. People of that age were frightening in these societies. What was wrong with them? Why hadn't they died? You know, people, they were twice the age that they should have been, you know, and they became absolute outcasts. With that, of course, I've already implied, you know, we can look at social ranking. We can see that there are some individuals who seem to be richer than others and poorer, and and it doesn't entirely go with age. It's a very sort of meritocratic, pragmatic society. You know, what you could put into society was what you would get out of it, and it looks as if positions of status were available for those who could actually get them. But still, there are richer and poorer individuals. We can also see there are some communities, some cemeteries that are just richer or poorer than other ones. And most importantly of all, that's something that changes over time. We see it becoming more fixed, whether you're born into a wealthy group or not. And grouping is something that is extremely important. We can look at details of the artifacts that come out of these graves, and in some cases we can see extremely close connections. We might be able to see that the same tool has been used to punch different objects that have turned up in different sites, and that they're connected in that way. So we build up networks of very local connections, how things are done within a single site, what's regional, how they interact with neighbouring ones, but also we see some really quite long distance connections as well. RAF Lake and Heath, which I've been doing a lot of work on, that's quite interesting. It's on the eastern side of the Fens, it's in Suffolk, but in fact these people are having almost nothing to do with the interior of Suffolk. They're exchanging their richest material, they're going across the Fens. It's a waterborne connection. We'll find the closest parallels in Northamptonshire, in Rutland, in Lincolnshire, and so on. And all of those are really illuminating for us in reconstructing just how things were being done at that time. And let's bear in mind, this is crucial to know what happened when you have a complete systemic collapse and the Roman Empire falls apart. It's tied in with colossal climate change as well, and this is when the foundations of England are really established. It's not just a curiosity to want to know about this. Now, chronology is a really vital technique in all of this, and that's what I'm really going to be focusing on today, and that's because it means we can know if we are comparing things that belong within a single time frame. We can see just how closely can we focus down on this period. When I started out in Anglo-Saxon archaeology some 40 years ago now, half centuries were really the closest we could get with anything, and there's an awful lot of things where you just said, oh, it's 6th century or it's 7th century or something like that. We're much closer now, and not only does it give us a more fine-grained view of the period, but it also allows us to go in much more detail into those questions of just how things are changing, how quickly are they changing, does it speed up, does it slow down, and so on. So to move on then to the various methods of dating that we use, I must say it's a matter of great pride to me that as the sort of teaching in Cardiff, I used to give the first year students an introduction to dating techniques. What would be more useful? I wish somebody had given me that, as a first year student. When would a bunch of flowers be appropriate? Do you write poems? What do you do? Well, this is the more dull side of dating techniques that we're doing here. Again, just a little bit of terminology there. We typically tend to talk about relative and absolute dating in a very easy and offhand way. And when we talk about relative dating, all we're doing is saying, well, without putting a particular date in terms of calendar years on something, we say we absolutely know this is earlier than that. Stratigraphically, you've got one layer below another one. The lower layer has got to be earlier. So we've got earlier than, later than, and contemporary are the terms in that. But then there's absolute dating, which I have to say the laboratory scientists hate us for using that particular term. But that's dating in terms of calendar years, BC or AD. And sometimes we do have evidence from Anglo-Saxon graves which provides us with absolute dates for the burial, or at least a reference point. We may have a grave that contains the name of an emperor, a coin, which got the name of an emperor and king on it, and obviously that coin has got to be produced after the start of the reign of that particular ruler. There's dendrochronology. I think I've got some examples down in here. Yes, okay, here's a grave from Suffolk. A woman was buried wearing a pendant, and that pendant was made of a gold coin, which is issued by a particular king, Dagobert. who reigned from 629 to 639. So we can say 629 is an absolute terminus post quem, the date after which cannot possibly be earlier than that to contain that. Now, obviously, there's going to be a certain amount of time for that coin to have reached Suffolk. You might look at the coin and say, well, it's very, very worn down, or it's absolutely mint, and make some estimates about how new it was. And then what's going to happen to it when it's taken, as it were, apparently changed from coin use and made into a jewellery. Those are things we don't know, but we can at least say that grave cannot possibly be earlier than AD 629. This was very exciting. These sort of just came up within the last week or two. I actually found myself on Radio 4, and if anyone heard it, it's 7:15 on Sunday morning. The Sunday programme is a religious affairs programme, but because it's a Christian cemetery, they wanted somebody to talk about it. Individuals who've been buried in oak logs, split in half, hollowed out, put in there. These should be very, very closely datable indeed. One of the most spectacular dendrochronological dates that I know of is a Danish Bronze Age oak log coffin, which they've managed to narrow down to a 6-week period in 1370 BC, which is truly fantastic. If the bark is there, you know what year it is. If you're lucky, you're going to get insects have burrowed in there, be in a certain state of pupation that could only happen in a late summer or something like that, and you can pin it down for that. So I'm pretty confident they're going to get some really very accurate dates out of these. So those sort of things can give us those absolute dates. And just to sort of flip back very quickly, the final one, but one I am going to be talking about a bit here, is radiocarbon dating. And basically the way radiocarbon dating works is that it provides an estimate, a measure, of the time that has elapsed since an organism has died. So you could do a radiocarbon date on that wood too, but it's most unlikely ever to be as accurate as dendrochronology for that.
A lot of people go, oh, it's 15th or 16th century, but the problem with radiocarbon is that you're still getting that massive error mark.
Well, we can pull that down. You can pull the radio, I'll show you some things on this. We've got it down to plus or minus 12, 13 years. Okay, you can get it down. I must admit the extreme one we got was one that was in the lab. Basically, if you leave it in the counters for longer and longer and longer, you narrow down the error what. This was one that got forgotten about because the woman technician went off on maternity leave and it stayed there for a long time and came down. But it shows it can be done anyway. Okay, so I'm going to sort of talk you through a number of things that we use for dating techniques, because this will be relevant for the sort of things we do together here. I'm starting actually with some examples from the male graves in the Anglo-Saxon chronology. So that, for instance, we're wanting to decide what types of objects, we're wanting to put labels and define the types of objects that are in these graves. Now, you go back to sort of very, very old archaeological publications, mid-Victorian ones, what they will say is, the type, it's a spear. And that's the only thing they'll say about it, that it's a spear. Now, we're now trying to sort of get this down to what particular type of spear is it. And in the case of these spears, the fact is we've developed in this particular book here that you're welcome to have a look at after this, a very careful way of describing the shape of the spearhead there. It's using various measures and comparing them across the others and trying to define particular types. Has to be said, it's moderately successful, but not brilliantly successful with spearheads. What we did, however, find was really useful in the male graves are the shields that they are carrying. Those are much more chronologically significant than the spears they've got. And I've just sort of put up here the 5 basic types or classes of shield boss that we're talking about here. Well, you know, this one stands out quite literally like a sore thumb. It suddenly became the done thing in the 7th century to carry shields with these very, very protuberant bosses on them. They can take various shapes as well, and we subdivide them according to the shape, but basically we just define those on being of a certain length. When we come through all of these, there are subtle things. There's this one with this very concave wall there. That's really quite an early type. These two types, in fact, are more or less contemporary, and you're more likely to get more examples of this class here in this area than you will of that particular class, and you certainly don't get these over in East Anglia or up in Lincolnshire or something like that. But then they move to these ones. They've got very straight walls there, little overlap there. These tend to be concave on the cone, even if very, very slightly. These, if anything, are very slightly convex. The difference between this one and this one is purely and simply that this one's got a much narrower flange than that one, and yet it turns out that's chronologically extremely significant. And you, as I said, you have to get into some very detailed aspects of the sizes and shapes to be able to pick out these different types. Put this in for Alan here. Well, I didn't just put it in for Alan here, but I'm glad we've got somebody who's very enthusiastic about beads in the audience, which I'm pleased about. This is going into the women's dress, and while there are many elements of women's dress, and I'm certainly not going to sort of run through all of them that we can study and use within our putting together of a chronology, what we actually found was most significant of all are the beads that women are wearing around their necklace. That's quite interesting because most of the items that we've got, the women's dress accessories, we think are actually functional and practical. If they're wearing brooches, they're not just wearing brooches to look nice or, you know, to make an impression. They're wearing brooches because they actually hold the garment together over the shoulders in a practical way, or hold a cloak in front, under the chin, over the breast. But these beads, they don't actually need the beads for anything, or at least nothing in terms of holding the dress together. But the women are wearing a lot of beads. Interestingly, the types of beads on the whole are the same across the whole of England, which you can't say about most of the other forms of women's dress very early on. And they are also types that we can tie in very closely to what women were wearing on the continent as well. They're very informative indeed. In fact, we had a Cardiff PhD was done recently, where a guy did a very, very close study of the chemistry of the glass that's in these beads. And what he was able to show is that when we're in this early section up here, they're reusing a lot of Roman glass. We know they were mining Roman sites for glass and metal scrap that they could reuse. So they're reusing a lot of Roman glass, then they're melting it down and making beads for it. However, they are still getting fresh glass. Glass is being made in the Near East. It's Palestine, Israel, Egypt. Those are the places you can make the glass, huge bricks of it. It's being shipped into Europe. Some of it gets over to England, and they are getting some of that, and they're using it. Interestingly, when they get down to this level here, not only are they getting that glass and using it, but they're making it go further by mixing in wood ash locally. That leaves a chemical signature, and you could pick that out, and it is very closely correlated with the types of beads that are being used. I don't think I've put in sort of slides to show that, but you know, you can work back from this to understand a lot about long distance contacts and trade that's going on there. But once we've got those types, in order to produce a chronology, we do something called seriation. And well, you'll understand what the model is that I'm showing here now. This is something that it's computer based, but it's something that I'd be very keen to be working through with any group of you who wanted to do it, and to show you how to do it. It's basically if you can run Microsoft Excel, you can learn how to do this, and not least because it's a form of study that is based on a very simple two-way matrix. What's the principle of seriation? Well, it's something that it's always attributed to a man called Flinders Petrie, leading Egyptian archaeologist back in the 1890s. I think he just got the credit for writing down what everybody was doing anyway, but he did at least write the thing. And it says, okay, we've got a series of contexts such as graves. Let's take an absolutely perfect situation. Every one of these graves includes 4 objects. Let's say it's a male grave with a spearhead, a shield boss, a sword, and a buckle. Okay, that would be absolutely perfect. What we would expect to happen through time is that you get gradual obsolescence and of some types and introduction of new types. So let's suppose the first one has got A, B, C, D, a type A buckle goes out of use, and a type E buckle comes in its end. So you would expect in a perfect, absolutely perfect series, at earliest grave A, B, C, D, then B, C, D, E, then C, D, E, F. That's complete. And in terms of a matrix, if you just put it out, you have your types going that way, your graves going that way. That's the sort of nice, neat line you would see in a matrix. And again, when I started out in the 70s, people were doing this by hand. They were cutting out strips of things, moving them around, trying to get things to fit together in that way. This was before the desktop personal computer made it all a great deal easier for us to do. And this is that pattern that I showed you before. This is using a technique called correspondence analysis. Correspondence analysis is essentially a mathematical technique that doesn't actually analyze the archaeology there. What it does is it analyzes the matrix you produce with that. So the decisions that you make in saying, I'm going to call it that type rather than another type, make a fundamental difference. The correspondence analysis is looking at that sort of matrix. But the great thing is, you could muddle that matrix up absolutely. You could have those grave numbers in any order, and if that pattern is lying in there somewhere, correspondence analysis will find it. And an absolutely perfect series, like that one that I've just showed you there, will produce what's called a perfect parabola in the correspondence analysis. If anybody's really into maths, we can go through it over several weeks at some other stage. It is actually explained in that book up to the point where I say, and now, it would take another book to write how you actually do this bit. But the underlying maths actually isn't all that very difficult, and certainly not of the ideas. But basically, you can put your graves, you can have your types in sort of rows and columns correspondingly. There's a certain point where you've done that, you press a button and you see what comes out. Well, it doesn't come out like that unless you set up a completely artificial matrix like I've done. But that does show you what you're looking for and what you're trying to get. This is the sort of thing that we get in reality. So this is what we did in this book, where we spent years looking at the Anglo-Saxon burials, separating out the male and the female ones, of course. And as far as the male graves were concerned, we got a very, very good result indeed. This really is a good parabola. Interestingly, things that we would say is that these absolute extreme ones hanging out at the end are probably not very significant. We shouldn't place too much attention there. But we looked at the sequence that we'd got going around there, and then we're putting in lines there just to say where we think we can see some sort of clusters and breaks within it. I'll explain that. Fundamentally with this technique, you can actually separate out the rows and the columns. So that's a plot of the graves, that's a plot of the artifact types. Women are, I regret to say, a bit less well behaved in this respect. You might think, well, okay, you can see the curve going round. It's not too bad, but when you get this sort of rather sickle-shaped thing and the turning point isn't sort of at the cross point of your axes, it's over there, you've really got two sequences that are joining together in that way rather than a single sequence going out. Nevertheless, we could still break it up in certain ways where we thought there were breaks to be made in it. We could test it and we say, actually, there is a chronological sequence running through this. The way we did that was through radiocarbon dating. Again, really apologies if I'm being too elementary here for some people here, but it's probably much better to make sure it. Basically, through respiration and through feeding, any living organism is going to be taking in carbon dioxide. And with that carbon dioxide, you're going to be taking in the different isotopes of carbon, of which carbon-14 is radioactive. It's not dangerously radioactive, it is radioactive. Carbon-14 is an incredibly, something like 0.2% of all the carbon that there is. It's a very tiny amount, but because it's radioactive, as soon as the organism dies, it starts to decay. And if you then measure the level of carbon-14 against carbon-13 and carbon-12, you can get a very accurate estimate of how much time has elapsed since that individual died. We actually know now, and they didn't know until about 1980, that the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere varies a great deal, and it varies basically in keeping with sunspot activity, and this is why you can't have a simple line. You have to what's called calibrate it. I'll show that shortly. There are other sort of interesting things that do come out of this, that the carbon dioxide down in the sea is very different from the carbon dioxide in the air. And if you have a diet which is composed entirely of sea fish, you will appear about 300 or 400 years older than you actually are through the carbon dioxide. There's a wonderful example of this on the coast of Denmark. It's on the boundary between the Mesolithic and the Neolithic, changed from a hunting to a farming economy. 2 women and 1 man looked as if they'd looked as if they'd been buried all at the same time. Did the radiocarbon dates. I said, "Oh my goodness me, these women are 300 or 400 years older, buried 300 years, 400 years before the man was." No, the women, in fact, in this society were stuck on the Mesolithic diet, which was fish, 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 and nothing but fish. And the man actually had preferential access to the red meat from the newly farmed animals that were there. And in fact, that you could show that they were actually contemporary.
It happened to Richard III as well, didn't it?
But Richard III, yes, yeah, different parts of him are of different dates, yes, apparently. Yeah.
Quite went for his death.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the thing about Richard III, of course, they know who it is and they know pretty much where he was all the way through, but it does show, yes, he moved to a colossally unhealthy diet as soon as he became king. Poor man, feasting himself almost to death. And this is much more what radiocarbon dating looks like in the lab. You have nice chaps like that with white coats twiddling with things. Hang on, is anything else going to come up? Oh yes, there we are. And basically that's the sort of sample, that's what you produce from, in fact, human bone that was used in this case. So there are new techniques for taking samples which make it actually much more practical than it was even 10 or 15 years ago now, but that was the way that we did it. As I said, high precision methods can give you estimates of the radiocarbon age of the sample, not the date, of plus or minus 13 years. Typically, we're actually getting plus or minus 17 or 18 from high precision samples now, but it doesn't actually cost a great deal more to do a high precision one. It's the difference between about 300 and 420 pounds, something like that. So in the right circumstances, it can be done. As I said, we know that sunspot activity varies greatly, and basically we can produce a thing called a calibration curve. It's not a curve, it's a calibration zigzag that goes like that. And what we actually have to do, this I don't think this is going to work. No, it's not. Sorry. This once upon a time, this was an animation that actually worked very nicely by showing you a calibration. The radiocarbon age is an estimate in statistical terms in normal distribution. In other words, 68% of the probability is in that area, 95% is in there. You can define how this goes. But you simply have to fire that probability often against the calibration curve for it to bounce down, and then you get an actual calibrated date, which gives you a much less even distribution of probability. And oh dear. Okay, well this is going to be a much better example to show you for that. This is off the cover of that book. That is the sort of probability that you get at the end of this, the sort of distribution of probability at the end of it, where, you know, in fact we can say for a particular sample, well, quite a lot of it's in that area there, quite a lot is in that area. It's unlikely to be there in the middle, but it actually could be. Sorry, it's a pity this one doesn't show up. I'm not quite sure how I managed to lose the sign of that, but it's a very, very nice example. Yes, something has gone wrong of that. But basically, okay, so we've got probabilities for individual radiocarbon dates. What we also did in this, and again, it's something that it's not actually that difficult to do, is when we can relate radiocarbon dates to one another, you can also mathematically calculate the relationship between those probabilities. At a site called Melbourne in Cambridge, we had an amazing quadruple stacker grave. We actually had two of them from this site. Grave dug fairly deep, another body put in over the first body, another body over the second body, and then another body over the fourth body. Did we know how long there was in between all of these? It could be down to only about a few years, 3 or 4 years in between the burials. It could be as much as a generation in between these burials. Actually, using this particular method, which I hope I'll work out a way of showing slides that'll make it a little bit clearer. You can actually work out what the relationship between these dates are. The interesting thing was that this is starting from the bottom. This was stratigraphically the very earliest burial to go in there. This was the second burial to go in, but this one actually had an older radiocarbon age than that one, but not much. And just once you looked at the probability, you say, well, it's got to be later than that. And it says, yes, that's perfectly possible. You take this bit of probability and that bit of probability, and they fit together. Basically, we could show that those burials had been made more or less a generation apart over about a period of 70 or 80 years. That grave was reused generation after generation. We don't have DNA or anything like that to say that the people were closely related, but that it was over a long period of time it was used. And as I said, this all came out in this particular book that I've got here, which, as I say, you'll be very welcome to have a look at. Now, we took these 4 techniques there, which really go from the most old-fashioned in archaeology to the very newest in archaeology, and you really use them iteratively. You start out looking at the typology, you decide what you think are your most useful types, you put that into a seriation, you see if it works. If it doesn't, you go back to your typology and see if you can improve it in that way. But once you've done that, once you've got your series, you're happy with it, then you do some radiocarbon dating to see if it looks, if it's work. You can do the Bayesian modelling. But then from all that, you can take those results and go back to the beginning and say, actually, now we think we can improve what we're doing there. And this is really where we are now in relation to the cemeteries that have come up here in Wessex and what we can do them. We've got a framework like this that has been put up, but it's a framework that can definitely, will always be capable of being improved, and not least can it be improved if it is applied to a particular region such as this. This is actually showing what we got with the male graves from Anglo-Saxon England. This is running from the second quarter of the 6th century here, 525 to 545. You'll be able to look at all this in a little bit more detail on the thing, up towards the end of the 7th century, and it's really a pretty perfect line that's running through there. We tried 2 slightly different ways of breaking it up and got 2 slightly different results, you know, as you would. That was fine. The women, as I said, were really rather problematic in this respect, and I remember I talked about there being 2 separate sequences that are just about holding on to one another, and that's really what we've got here. We've got a really, really tight line here, which is running again from probably the second quarter of the 6th century up to 575, 580, something like that. Then we've got a wobbly bit for 40 or 50 years, and we've got them just about holding on to each other, spreading out those dates there, but they do hold on, they do keep in touch. And then we get this amazing last 50 years in the 7th century where stuff is being piled into women's graves, lots more women's graves. Women's graves are outnumbering male graves that we can identify by about 6 to 1 at this point. I think actually the explanation is that this is the time where we start getting Anglo-Saxon laws, and there is a sort of weapon control going on at this time. There are laws, very strict penalties. If you lend a sword to somebody and something bad happens with it, you are responsible. They are controlling these things. And if you like, the women's burials are the proxies for the power and prestige of the family, the household that is burying there. There are very fewer weapon graves at this time. Where's all that weaponry gone? Well, it's gone into the Staffordshire hoard. You know, quite a bit of it. You know, suddenly we've got nearly 100 swords represented in that one hoard. We've got nothing remotely like that from all the burials that we've got in England. Yeah.
With regard to the women's graves.
Yeah.
Is there something in there about, this is just a thought off the top of my head, about the fact that things maybe have been passed down through generations, and therefore you get to a point where it does go to the grave, but it would appear to be of a type that would have been earlier.
Very little, surprisingly, very little. We do pick it up sometimes, and there are some cases where one artifact type within a grave, we're saying we're going to discount this because we just think it is so old and it stands out like that. Now, it's certainly true, it can be, in these women's beads necklaces, it's perfectly possible that a woman, you know, if she's got 20, 30 beads, there's a moderate chance that one of them could be as much as 100 years old. We also actually picked it up, we think, though actually I'm not 100% certain about this, but we think we picked it up in the ship grave at Sutton Hoo, Mound 1, is the one man who's got 7 spears in the one assemblage, and one of those spearheads looks as if it's 100 years old when it went in there. But it's actually much, much rarer, you know, than you would expect. It's certainly not disrupting what we're looking at here. And no, I mean, the women here, this is really a la mode stuff, you know, that they are being buried with, and they're using gold, and the gold fineness is varying because the gold is getting less and less. You know, it's on the whole, it's current stuff that is going into those graves. Well, okay, I won't pause on that one. We can move on there. This is quite an interesting one. This sort of makes that point that I made there. This is in terms of our sample. Before there, we haven't fully sampled, but that's it. The number of, the frequency of men being buried largely with weaponry that we can see around about the middle of the 6th century, or probably just before the middle of the 6th century, it is diving from a very high point, from when it's very common, down to a low point. It stays at that low point, wiggles a little bit, but that's probably our sample, and then drops away, so that, and then before 700, it's all over. Women likewise coming down from a high point. Don't worry about whether the peak is higher in one or the other, it's probably more or less equal. Comes down, actually dips down even lower than the men, from about 580 through to 620. Really, really hard to find women's graves. But then we've got this extraordinarily jump at this point. And as I say, at this point, women's graves are at least 6 times more frequent than male graves for us to be able to find. I did want to say a little bit more about this site here, RAF Lake and Heath, which I've again had the great privilege of being asked to come in as the sort of academic Anglo-Saxonist to work on that project there, and where Richard was, I don't know, what would he be, sort of project officer or something like that, was already kicked off as an... The man who gave us money for it. It's a really, really interesting site. It's USAF based, but RAF. Settlement is around a spring there, and then we've got 3 discrete burial grounds to the south of that, and then another one away over there. We've done a lot of dating from here. And interesting, because we identified this problem with the women's graves, we really went on the women's graves there, and we've tried to find out. And in fact, what we've been able to show here is we really do have a really smooth run through from the 5th century through to at least the middle of the 7th century there. That continuity really is there if you actually look for it. What's even nicer, I'm just going to sort of jump back a couple here. This little cemetery down here, there are no grave goods in it. The graves are aligned east-west. It's looking very, very much like a Christian cemetery. And what we've been able to show from the radiocarbon dates here is that it does indeed look as if that cemetery up there, according to this model, just carries straight on. They finished in one cemetery, moved down to the other one, and carried on burying there. It fits with all, you know, the mathematics and the probability of it. Now, this is something that's been denied. There's been a great deal of argument. What was the impact of conversion to Christianity? We concluded in this book that we thought in the 670s there was a definite transition from a pre-Christian burial rite, I don't use the word pagan, to a Christian burial rite. Here we've absolutely got it. We've got it laid out for us there. Lovely to think if those great Ryborough coffins would show the same thing going on here, but we've got the burials absolutely side by side there. So What can we sort of be looking to do around here? Well, we've already got a good chunk of Wiltshire cemeteries in our national database for using for this. It's a long list of sites. Some of these sites there's only 1 or 2 burials actually there. And as I said, there is some really exciting, sorry, it should be barrow clump singular, shouldn't it, rather than clumps. But there's a number of recently excavated sites that could most definitely be added to this. And if we could do a project together on this, the thing to be doing would be to, first of all, be gathering the data as it becomes available. I know Collingbourne Duchess, I think, was just published earlier this year. Market Lavington is already available. Barrow Clump is being worked on. I've been in touch with Nick Stoodley about that, and I think Phil is, the project manager. So the availability of this stuff will be there. The first thing to do would be to work through it and sort out the typology, what we think the types are. But I would also emphasise on the typology, whatever types we've used so far, those could probably be improved upon, and there may be ones that would be special for this area that you would particularly want to be bringing into that. We then also learnt from RAF Lake and Heath. It was a very, very valuable exercise, and indeed the results from that in terms of chronology are sufficiently important that they go beyond what we're going to be able to put in the RAF Lake and Heath Cemetery excavation report. And I've been talking to the Society of Antiquaries, who are probably going to do another major chronological publication, just adding that material in. But for the first time, we compared the national framework and sample with a regional one for East Anglia and then with a local one for that particular site. And it's very, very interesting indeed, because you get different phase boundaries that work at different levels. They match, they are all pictures of the same sequence, but interestingly at the national level you can cut things up much more finely than you can at a local level. It seems surprising. I'm not quite sure theoretically why that would be, but it would be a very, very useful thing to do here. Certainly one could do this individually with sites like Collingbourne Duchess, Winterbourne Gunner, where we're talking about 80 burials and so on. But it would also be very useful to do it at a county level, spread it out, Somerset, Dorset, bring in the Hampshire cemeteries too. This is where I'm saying you can keep going on this. And what will be really valuable about this is that it'll help us to address a real problem. I talked about that fact that there's this trough in the frequency of female burials where they've really seemed to have disappeared. That's represented by comparing these two phases. This is a distribution of the burials that we put into phase B of the females. This is what we've got in phase C of the females, and we've got this whole area of Saxon England, Sussex, Essex, Middlesex if you can, that Wessex around there. The whole of the Thames Valley just isn't giving us samples in that particular area. What it looks like if you do it in terms of correspondence analysis, this is a sort of broken matrix here. It'll give you something like that. Quite the opposite of your parabola there, where the two groups just go as far apart as they can on the graph there. So I'm very confident indeed that we will be able to address this, fill this in, and find out what is happening and why it is. If it's an interesting phenomenon nationally, that the frequency of women's graves goes down very low. If we've got a region in which it's at an extreme for that, then to be able to really look at that phenomenon in this region is going to be very illuminating for us indeed. As I say, I'm quite confident as at RAF Lakenheath, if you really strain yourself and look after and throw everything you've got at it, you will be able to find that continuity, but we'll certainly be able to know a great deal more about it. And as I said, it isn't just a matter of curiosity. It isn't, if you like, just a matter of gender balance or something like that. The way both the males and the females are being portrayed in the burial record is itself representative of what the stresses and the forces are within society generally. And this is precisely at the point at which you are moving from that relatively egalitarian society that I sorted out, where fundamentally your status was your individual status according to just how fit and strong you were, to a society in which status is much more something you're born into the right family, and then you do get the higher status with that. So that's what I wanted to present to you by the way of introduction for what we've got here. As I said, well, obviously I'm very keen to answer any questions, but I'm also very keen indeed to talk about the practicalities of if this is something that we can, work together on with this, because, for me, it's going to be great just to sort of, enable more people to do these things at the same time as you doing some absolutely critical work in terms of Anglo-Saxon archaeology. So there we are. That's that. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, John.
If off the time being, Richard, so is there anything that you want to answer from the biochemical perspective? Maybe.
Yeah.
Well, all the material's been looked at now, and the reports are all done. So the material is there, but the osteological and the findings.
Is this Barrow Clump, is it? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, Nick said it. Well, I heard from Nick about 6 weeks ago, and he said it was pretty much done.
Yes.
So, yes.
That's right.
Yeah.
For publication next calendar year.
Yeah.
Great.
Yes.
Good. Yes, the finances will be with you at the end of the financial year.
Yeah.
So it's 74 burials, is that right?
Yeah, I think that's
74. So there's a good data set,
Yeah.
of which probably about a third have got grave goods. Is that about right?
yeah, just that, yes.
Yeah.
I think,
Yeah.
of course, we've had those recent radiocarbon data from that group that were unaccompanied, and
Yes. Well, so Richard was. Yes.
have come back as 7th or even one of them 8th century.
Yeah. Well, that would be fine. Yeah. It'd be nice to sort of have a look at the absolute plan with that, and see how they work out.
Yes. Well, we've got all that in.
Yeah.
Well, all the draft form.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think if people do want to do this, I mean, I would be starting. The key thing to do would be to start with the typology. Just sort of get used to knowing what particular types. How do you identify them as those specific types? And learn. And with that, in fact, one thing you learn is, however watertight we try and present it as in a book like this. One of the interesting things, so if you remember those spearheads that are put there, and you've got this, you're measuring the width at its point of maximum width, and then you're going 3/4 of the way up to the tip. Well, the tip has almost always broken off a spearhead. So you've got somewhere between 3 and 8 millimeters up there where you're sort of guessing and projecting it a little bit. We treat them as if, they look as if they were made to be perfectly symmetrical, but of course they never are. With the shield bosses, we have a measurement which is diameter of the shield boss. Well, you can only have a diameter if you're a perfect circle, and they could never quite get a perfect. So apart from the fact that these two are coming in damage, so you're making compromises, trying to fit these things into a sort of a model system of typology, and you do sort of need to get confident about doing that. With these artifacts and treating them in that way. So and the range of types is very large. So it would be the important first step to get used to the typology. But then you can pop them into the matrices, and then you can start playing around with correspondence analysis on them too. The correspondence analysis, we use a program that the one I use was produced by a man in Denmark, a man called Torsten Madsen, but it's free shareware, and it's an add-on in Excel. So if you've got Excel, you can simply go to Torsten Madsen's site, download it, and it's a 3 or 4 minute job to add it into Excel. It's then 3 or 4 days, as we said, to really get used to sort of how to actually operate it. But in fact, most of the problems is you make silly little mistakes in Excel rather than anything that's wrong, with the correspondence analysis program. So it's a fairly easy thing to do, really.
John, Bridie mentioned about heirlooms. And
yes.
Like that, and you were talking about the mining for glass and things like that.
Yes.
Do you think they mined for heirlooms almost? I mean, we've had quite a few probably Roman brooches, haven't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not very...
It's one of those things that does seem to vary a bit from place to place. I mean, they certainly mined for the metals, and they were recycling those. There's no question about that. There are some sites where you find a lot of reused Roman stuff. I mean, the really extreme one is Great Chesterford in Essex, which is a cemetery. It's right alongside a Roman small town. If it's got Chester in the name, there's a Roman site there. And Great Chesterford is one of those, and there really is a lot of Roman stuff in the graves there. Usually it's quite rare, but you will even find, they'll pick up an Iron Age brooch and still use it. It does happen occasionally. There doesn't seem... I'm not aware of a huge amount of interest in just collecting Roman objects as curios, keepsakes, worth having. What we do find is, they'll pick up a fossil sea urchin, they'll pick up a very nicely worked flint, they'll pick up something from the Bronze Age, and they are likely to just hold on to that as a curiosity. What we do also see, certainly in East Anglia, is that a style of Romano-British women's dress that's wearing a lot of bracelets, those do turn up in the Anglo-Saxon period, but actually it's moved to children's dress. The one thing I didn't say, you've got male and female. Children are another group. Again, they tend to be very low furnished, but there are systematic differences, and one of the interesting ones is this traditional Romano-British form of dress survives as children's dress, at least in Essex and East Anglia, rather than being worn by adult women. So, it just comes down to, it looks as if overwhelmingly you talk about an incredibly pragmatic approach to this material. They held on to coins a bit. We've got quite a number of pierced coins that they wore, but in terms of the metal, we don't know how much of the metal was just melted down coin, but they did wear those as pendants, the Roman coins.
Yes, we've had a few perforated Roman coins, haven't we?
Yeah. That's typical, really. So.
Is Barton typical of that period, or is it quite typical?
Well, I've only seen what's in current archaeology, so I haven't had an opportunity to look across the range of the stuff yet.
Yeah,
so.
What Nick's saying, Nick's writing up on the metalwork, yes, because he's also written up the metalwork from...
He did Collingbourne, didn't he? Yeah.
And Market Lamington as well.
Yeah.
No, he wrote a discussion for that, so he did look at it.
Yeah.
So, yes, I think on the whole, it is,
Yeah. Well, there are very few sites that aren't. Well, there are a few sites that you would say are just not typical, then again, you would hardly, there's no site that's exactly the same as another one. They've all, as I said, you've got this local level, the regional level, and the national level, and you do get interest. The differences are subtle but very, very interesting between these sites. I mean, one thing I would be interested in this particular, we've got a site at Petersfinger near Salisbury, and there's some really early stuff there. Going back well into the 5th century at Petersfinger. And, that would be interesting to see if you've got other ones that are coming out with that sort of, with anything that's going back into that area. Or in these sort of sequences we put up, we just have to use Petersfinger to anchor it at one end, and then you find your sequences, through the more common stuff after that.
Yeah, our starts, it is 6th century. Really nothing.
Yeah.
You can really push back into the 5th.
Yeah.
But now with these other radiocarbon dates, it clearly goes beyond 6th.
Yeah. Well, I mean that'll be good, because once we come into the period around about 630 onwards, then again, Wiltshire comes back in a strong way. You've got Swallowcliffe down, Rodney down. You've got these big barrow burials with rich female graves in them, and so it does reappear there. Even on that sort of Saxon one there, we've got a site, it's sort of outside of this area, but Lechlade in Gloucestershire there. At Lechlade we've got burials in the early part of our sequence, and we've got burials at the later part of our sequence. So, they didn't go away and come back to that site. They, it must have carried straight on through. But the fact is, we cannot find an unbroken sequence of female burial in the Saxon area yet. So.
Yeah, we can stretch it through into the later 7th, if we include the Southampton Stadium side.
Yes, yeah. Well, as I said, I think what stuff that was being put to 680, 690, even 700, I think we've probably shown in this book, probably it's being dated a little bit too late. It's, and it was based on coin dates, and those just don't seem to be quite as reliable as they once thought to be. But yes, you've got that very, very late group of material there. So.
Do you get any strange data or anomalies when it comes to trade networks, things like that? I think that's really stood out.
Well, yes. I mean, is it any? Nothing that you takes your breath away. You thought, goodness me, I'd never have thought that could possibly have happened. It was genuinely interesting with RAF Lake and Heath to see that they are going across the fens, presumably by boat, to exchange material. Now, a lot of this material, it's coming in, it's where it's really visible is in the female dress accessories, and it's almost certainly what's being exchanged is not the material, but it's actually the women. You have marriage relationships, exogamy is going on over fairly long distances there, and that is being brought in from that around the fen edge, and they're not really very interested in going into the hinterland of East Anglia. That was a surprise, but it's another example of something we've already seen. There's a very interesting connection between the area of northern Norfolk, and they seem to be going up the coast to Humberside, and there's very, very close connections between those. Between southern Cambridgeshire, we find the same stuff is turning up in Warwickshire, in the Avon Valley there. So that sort of distance of connection we are seeing. One that I do know of that just about comes down into this area here. We've got a particular object turned up not very far from Marlborough. It's just inside Berkshire, and its closest parallel is up in the very, very southwestern tip of Northamptonshire, which is actually not all that far away as the crow flies, about 50 miles or something like that. But there's a Roman road runs absolutely straight in between the two places where we've got these spots. runs through a whole load of Anglo-Saxon sites where you don't get this material, but it looks, and it's a female object, and it just looks for all the world as if you're looking for a bride. That they look to that particular area, and a woman will have moved over that distance to come into that area, bringing these objects with her, because she was dressed in a way that belonged in Northamptonshire and certainly doesn't belong in this area here. So you can get to incredibly close levels of detail. My doctorate work ages ago, I was actually looking at connections between Scandinavia and England long before the Vikings, and even there you can show some really close connections. We got objects that they are Norwegian objects. There's no doubt about that. The whole design, it's absolutely Norwegian. They're very rare in Norway, but you can tell they developed there where they belong there. And yet it's found in England. Not only is it found in England, but the quality of the metal, which is much poorer than you get in Norway, shows it was made locally. So these things are coming in and being copied. You do learn a great deal about the exchange. Trade is an interesting question as to whether they're actually trading these things in a sort of commercial sense or just exchanging them. I think, certainly when we're in the 5th and the 6th century, it's probably much easier to think, the exchanges are personal exchanges. You give something not to immediately get something back, but to create an obligation on the person who receives it. It's really right at the very end of this period that we start seeing coinage coming in and becoming so common, that it's clearly being used just for buying and selling things.
John, can I a point of clarification?
Sure. Sorry.
Particular map that
Yeah.
you have there.
Yeah.
What you're saying is that there is this gap.
Yeah.
Is that because no burials have been found, or they haven't been analysed?
It's because they haven't been identified. It's a slightly different thing from that. So in that sense, they haven't been found. But let's say they haven't been found by the people who are looking at them in this light. I'm not saying they don't exist there, in the collections, but either our techniques aren't good enough to pick them up, or we just, for some reason, didn't pick them up. I mean, our sample, the sample that we took, should have picked up everything that was available from around about the year 530 onwards. I went round every collection I could. We went through all of the publications down to January 2005. Anyway, we had St Mary's, Southampton in as well. And so we haven't picked them up, but it's, as I said, you have in principle to allow for the fact that they might not be there. It may be that this drop in frequency of women's burial was so extreme in this area that it actually did drop down to zero. Not that women weren't dying and being buried, but they just weren't being buried with anything in the grave at all. I don't believe that, but it is theoretically, you have to allow it as a possibility. As I say, I think much more realistic is to say that the level of visibility is very, very low, and we've got to improve our sight to find it. And that will come, I'm sure, through changes in all of these levels, a better knowledge of typology relevant to this particular area, better knowledge of the data that's now available. New sites have come up. We can see. I'm sure it can be done.
So is there a suggestion then that skeletons have been recovered in the past?
Yeah.
Because they haven't got anything. I'm doing this as my own
Yeah.
interpretation.
Yeah.
But there has been nothing with them
Yeah.
that can actually physically put them, unless you
Yeah.
carbon dated everything.
Yeah. That's it. Yeah.
Physically put them in the time frame that you're.
Yeah, that's really it. And as I said, with our AF Lakenheath, we went really determinedly at this, and you know, these were women who did have diagnostic artifacts with them, but you're down to a couple of tiny orange beads. And if they had that, we dated them. And this gave us an absolutely smooth line right the way through. It's still true that at RAF Lake and Heath, if we do the demographic projections on the people who are burying there, we seem to have a drop in population of somewhere in the region of 80% in the second quarter of the 6th century. You know, the number of people burying there just goes right down. You know, and there's no getting away from that. We don't know whether they moved elsewhere or what, but you know, there's no.
So, what about impact of cremation? I mean,
Yeah.
when was cremation popular in comparison to some of these inhumation burials?
Varies from place to place, but on the whole, we would say cremation is holding its own in the first half of the 6th century. It falls away in frequency very strongly in the second half of the 6th century, and by the time you've crossed the year 600, you crossed into the 7th century, it's very rare and exceptional indeed.
So the period you're actually looking at is cremation is not the...
No, it's a...
So
well...
You're not missing...
Unless we're missing them totally, you know, unless they're cremating the dead without using cremation urns, and they would, you know, you can think of scenarios, but yeah, you know, yeah.
In terms of cremation and climate change, there's a period of climate change.
Yes, right. Well, this is something I was almost terrified to say it, but actually the data are stacking up for this now. We know that there was a major climatic event in the period AD 536 to about AD 540, AD 541. Initially, it seemed like there'd been a single colossal dust veil. It's now thought that there were two, one immediately, you know, about a couple of years apart, which you'd hardly have told the difference. Mike Bayliss, the dendrochronologist at Queen's in Belfast, who first identified this, is absolutely convinced that the explanation is a comet strike somewhere on Earth that threw up a colossal dust veil. I know there are other geoscientists who say, no, we've managed to identify proper volcanic ash. You know, I don't have an opinion on this. It's not, you know, it's not my area. Something really major happened. You know, and we've got records in chronicles, literally around the world, reflecting this. You know, Japan through to Western Europe, something really big happened then, which also seems to have unleashed a major plague, which is recorded by Procopius in Constantinople. At that time. So things were really, really bad. The extraordinary thing was, we would have said, looking at Anglo-Saxon archaeology up until very, very recently, we can't see any sign of it at all. It's true, you can look osteologically at the people in these cemeteries, and there are stress markers in the teeth and in the bones, but it looks like quite literally everybody was likely to go through periods of want. You know, in a life of 30 to 40 years, every so often, there just wasn't much food around, and it was affecting you. You know, the rich and strong ones have got Harris lines, whatever it is. You know, the poor and suffering ones have got them just alike. Everybody absolutely got that, and you couldn't see one real horizon that hit this. In peat bogs, there's a particular line where sphagnum moss suddenly started growing again. Now that means it's cold and wet. The sphagnum moss really starts below. We haven't got anything like adequate radiocarbon dates on this, but if you do take the few that we've got and put them together, the median date that you've got for that recurrent service is, wait for it, AD 535. It was a year early, but with radiocarbon dating, that's amazing. Now, what you've got to do is go back and take dozens more samples to be able to make this dating. It is a very broad range over that. Equally, this tip over point and the population levels at RAF Lake and Heath, as implied by the cemetery, centres on the 530s. It is increasingly looking, Jim Peake's data on the beads, we're looking at a change in how beads were made, how glass was used, which is centering on the 530s. It's beginning to stack up that something major happened then. And we talk about this real low point in female burials, which is from the 570s through to the 620s, and that's true. But to get down to that low point, it looks like you're starting somewhere certainly between 525 and 550, and increasingly it's looking like it's in the 530s that you suddenly start dropping down in that way. So the possibility that in fact there's fewer furnished graves because there genuinely were fewer people is not one that we can rule out. But it's something you say with every possible warning against it, because you just don't know they've moved elsewhere. If, however, we go to the settlement side, we go to West Stowe, we go to Mucking or something like that, we're not looking at settlement sites that seem to be abandoned around this period. If we go to northern Germany, we do find them. In Niedersachsen, in Denmark, they talk about a break in settlement. Where they're just finding abandoned settlements. There's very little evidence of people. But there they say, well, everybody's moved over to Britain, and it's emigration that explains it. So yes, let's not go there. Yeah. So you look at things. You can see phenomena, and you've got to fit them into these patterns that spread wider and wider and wider. To try and realise what the dynamics are everywhere. But as I said, the excitement of being able to look at this level of detail, where you really are beginning to get confident that you can talk about what's happening in a particular decade, is quite extraordinary. And we as I said, we've got that at certain points on the sequence. There are other points where it's still not very good. It still remains the case that until Great Riboroad said there is no dendrochronology for Anglo-Saxon England, those will give us really, really precise dates. But, those wiggles in the radiocarbon curve inevitably mean there are some periods you can look at it in great detail, there are other periods you can't. The 5th century, I'm afraid, is going to remain fairly hopeless as far as radiocarbon is concerned, because the so-called calibration curve is just a straight line, it's a plateau. So that something that genuinely dates from AD 440 and something that genuinely dates from AD 520 have to be identical in terms of radiocarbon. And you could even squeeze your error margins down to 0. You can actually do this in modelling terms. Pretend you've got an absolutely perfect radiocarbon sample with no error on it, and you will still get the same splurge when you hit it off that calibration curve. Because it can't go anywhere else.
Okay, so what's the next stage then?
Yes, yeah, well...
what do you need? What's the timelines? What's the commitment? Where's it going to take place?
All of those are really practical things. To do the typology, all I need is to sit in a room with the people who want to do it, with we'd work out Collingbourne Dukes. We could just take the publication, and we can work off that. So that's a matter of sitting in a room. I'm happy to come down here. This is where people want to be. When we move on to doing the correspondence analysis, it is fun. Believe me, it's exciting. Putting it into and I'm e-phobic. I loathe computers, but even I like it when they work for me and I can do things. That's a point where I suppose absolutely ideally we'd be able to sort of get a computer that was projecting on a screen, or everybody with their anybody who's got a laptop or anything like that can bring it in, can have this in, you can just share the data between everybody without any problems at all. But it'd be nice to be able to sort of throw it up on a screen. Now, if it came to it, the right time, I know Cardiff University, we've got a computer teaching lab. We teach computer applications, and it could be that either people are here or, as Richard, we were talking about, if there's a companion group in South Wales or whatever, they'd be, we could bring them in there and do that.
Got a few people in Scotland that are interested, but
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, well, no. I mean that's absolutely great, and something I would say is that it can be done, at a distance, and I can move around. Obviously Scotland's a long way from Wales. So believe me, even Suffolk is a long way from Wales to when you go in there. But no, it can be done. I think interestingly, for that old-fashioned thing of there's going to be a point that if we start on typology, yes, you can do it from drawings and you can do it from books, but there's nothing compares to having the objects in your hand. Having them there, being able to look at them. Yeah, and I'm sure it can be sort of arranged to do. To do things like that. So we could work on that, and I think that'll take us a very long way, because as I said, we can keep bringing more and more stuff in. What I do anticipate is we're going to get to a point. You've got some radiocarbon dates from Barrow Clump, and so on. I'm sure we will come up with this where if you put them into this sort of model, then you say, actually, we really would love to have that one dated. We'd love to have that one dated. Now, there's a point, I find that if, say, we got to the point that we wanted to do some more radiocarbon dates to put them into models like this, if we talk, usually you want to do about 10 or 12 dates. So if you're talking about £4,000 to £5,000 or something like that, if you've got a watertight research proposal, you just write in your proposals, your bids, the funding is out there, you shoot at 6-7 targets and one of them, that sort of sum you can normally get, from somebody would fund it. But we're going to be, I would say, a year down the line before we get to that, because there's a lot we can do, and I suppose, no rush about it, but,
Is it worth considering the clump assemblage then, given it is all with you?
Yeah. Well, I still say yes.
Yeah.
So it's accessible in this region?
Absolutely, and I would say maybe the Clump and Collingbourne,
I think we still got Holland Market Lavington fairly easily.
Yeah, well,
Walford, you've got a few.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would say do them one at a time, but the interesting thing, if you took those three together, you'd be on a sort of a data assemblage which is around about the same in size as RAF Lake and Heath, all in, and that sort of really did work. That really did work. You can be at a point if you're looking at a single cemetery where you've got a total of 40 graves, there's a risk that you'd still be able to do something, undoubtedly with it, but you probably wouldn't be able to take it. That far.
If you want it, the black patch stuff as well.
Yes.
Also would be.
Yeah. Well, black patch is already in. We've already done black patch, but there will be some. There may be some early stuff at black patch that we could still bring in, and stuff that we've done certainly doesn't mean you can't go back to it and redo it and do it a bit better. This sort of thing, with the typologies, they're the best typology you've got at the time for the purpose that you want it for. And, there can always be things that will improve it.
Exactly, as you look at the artefacts, you'll find subtle differences.
Yeah, you can be just lucky and notice something, suddenly realise that something works. It's a good example from RAF Lake and Heath. There's one particular type of shield boss. It's the one where I said the flange becomes very narrow, and we just had that in as a single type in our typology, because that's what worked when we did it in the national one. We did it for RAF Lakenheath and it wasn't working. Something isn't right about it. And what we think we need to do is actually divide that type. So we've got to find out how we can distinguish the earlier ones from the later ones of it. Worked perfectly well. We didn't do anything wrong. Perhaps we were just, and perhaps, it just was an East Anglian type that came in on the fen edge of Suffolk earlier than it came in anywhere else. It's possible. I don't know quite why, but we've got to work on it. So you will find new things, certainly, and all typologies are, they're functional. You don't just, it isn't just absolutely it is this type and not that type. The type you put on it is only good if it's telling you something about it, and chronology is just one of the ways you can sort of divide things up in that way. So,
With the glass beads,
yeah.
Has anyone looked at the colours?
Yes.
The difference?
Yes.
Because certainly when my research with the Viking glass beads, when I looked at Denmark, Norway and Sweden, there were particular colours that were predominant in Sweden,
Yeah.
which you didn't get in
Yeah.
other places.
Yeah. Yeah, you as I said, you tend not to get much regional difference in the glass beads, which is really interesting. You do get some. There are some East Anglian types. But no, the colours is actually key to the typology. So that Beate Brugmann, there's a German woman who did the big study of the early Anglo-Saxon beads, which we use, although we've modified it slightly. But she, for instance, talks about one... Brugmann, yeah. She talks about one whole set of types which she calls traffic light beads because they're red, yellow and green. There's another set that she's calling Wedgwood beads because the colours are typical of Wedgwood, China, and so on. As I said, one of these key types for us able to find the sequence right through in RAF Lakenheath was looking at the orange beads, which they would call them orange terracotta. It's really simple terracotta stuff, but they're very distinctive. So yes, colours are treated very carefully with all of this, and the study of the beads showed that they could control the colours amazingly well. They really were good at mixing stuff in, and the colouring seems to have been done locally. The glass is all coming in from miles away.
I mean, the Vikings are saying there was a big trade where they was recycling Roman testa from sites.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that certainly in Riga in Denmark, there was a lot of predominantly blue and hardly any red.
Yeah.
Across the water in Britain,
Yeah.
red's a dominant colour.
Yeah. Actually, not in this way. Blue ones are very common early on here in England and in Norway too. There's lots of blue beads there. So yes, there seems to be a lot of cobalt-coloured glass around. So.
In Sweden, it's predominantly white.
Right. Yeah. They use Malibu bottles for that now in India. I know that. So that's how they get their white.
John, within the scope of the research,
Yes.
bear in mind we've managed to secure 5 Queen's Indigenous individuals to go to Winchester University on scholarships.
Yeah.
Is there scope for, of which at least one's represented here today,
Okay.
dissertation potential?
Definitely, without question. Yeah, certainly. Undergraduate, postgraduate too. Yes, yeah. Most definitely there is.
I think in terms of the timescales, that works really well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Sharpeny cranes, Rob. Huh? Sharpeny cranes.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, my son's joke about doing geography at university. It's where you get to colour the maps in. Yes.
So I guess the thing is, for people to think about it, if they're interested, Dick, if you want to put a call out in the next few days, along with the video when it goes out, and see who's up for it, because it may be people who are inspired by looking at the film to take part. As well as people who are
Richard, haven't you been talking to Richard Madgwick too? This is a colleague of mine in the Department of Archaeology. He's the osteologist, so the bone archaeologist specialist. But he and I.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Right. What's that?
Absolutely.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. However you wish to. Yes. Yeah. So as I said, we can coordinate with him too on the so that what we did when we took the obviously they'll have been done in house too, but. When we were radiocarbon dating these skeletons, we got Simon Mays at English Heritage did a sort of full autopsy basically on the skeletons, even if they'd already been done for one, so you get a second view on the whole thing.
Did the first parts of the Barraclough.
Yeah. Okay.
Assemblage and then another.
No, it's fine. You got the top people working on it there. So
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Still.
That's right, but we have actually got scope for isotope analysis and things like that too, if we wanted to go down those particular routes.
Still waiting on your isotopes, the Visigoth.
Oh, you're the guy who found the oh right, congratulations.
I told you, you're about the
Oddly, I've heard about you. So yes, yeah. No, it's lovely when you do get those. You do get those sort of really spectacular exotica turn up in these places. So,
Shut up about your accent.
yeah. Yes.
What
Yeah.
we've done, we've set up the open group for this, and so the people in the forces community, so to speak, and link to health areas or whatever can look at that. We've also set up the closed group, which we're going to link you on to tonight. So if there is any comments you've got, put them all on there. I can collate them all.
I don't want to be difficult. It's just sort of felt I was too old to do Facebook. Actually, as a university lecturer, you can get in serious trouble being on Facebook. You do want to avoid it, but I don't. I can be in a link. You're all. Anybody is welcome to email me at any time, and I'm just Hines Hines at cardiff.ac.uk. So I do email. It's just I sort of tended to keep off social media. So.
What are your time frames with all of this?
The great thing is, it's what works with you. I have got some deadlines. I've got a big thing to finish on the Staffordshire Hoard, which I sort of promised them for Friday this week. So I shall write to them on Friday. They're actually going to have it by Wednesday next week. So I think that's pretty good going. Then I go back and finish off RAF Lake and Heath, which is pretty much done, but it's collating in the final. It's the final edit through the whole thing and making sure everything joins up. So I'm going to be working on that, I think, pretty solidly through to Easter. But I can easily find days, afternoons like this, to sort of come down. So just what works for everybody else. If you're talking about an undergraduate dissertation that's to be done by next summer, or then obviously you want to be really getting on with that very soon. If we're talking about the next academic year, then we've got plenty of time. I suppose I think it would be nice, if there's enthusiasm to go on this, it'd be lovely to come in and start just looking at some typology, even if we just sort of got and photocopied the Colin Vaughan-Dukish report, and looked at the material there and started thinking about how you identify the things to type, then we could do that maybe in January, So, but just really what works for everybody else.
So we can sort of, in commitment terms, you could phase contributions. So someone might be really into the handling of the material, do the typology piece, do their contribution. Then there might be others that I call them geeks. I'm a bit of a technical but might really get into the series. That's so the contribution wouldn't need to be from start to finish.
It wouldn't need to be start to finish, but you sort of want to, and I think part of the attraction of it, for those who've dug the stuff up, what happens to it, everybody can do it. You just need, guidance to bring in. So. It's absolutely true, and the way this particular project went together, we had real specialists at the different levels, but there were times we were having to spend week after week with 3 of us coming in at different, from different things, working together, and you actually really did have to be explaining from one to the other. You couldn't just deliver it as a package of data and then say, what can you do with that? As I said, it's iterative. You keep going round the circle there. So, you can specialise in different areas, so there's no question of that. But it would be good for everybody to get a handle on typology.
In terms of accessibility.
Oh, yes.
This range of
No, I totally agree. I totally agree, but this is all stuff that can be done as sort of desktop work, and indoors, for the winter. I say that, I love digging too. I really do enjoy sort of getting out there and digging. I'm incredibly proud of my turfing technique. I had a very attractive female student. Oh, John, look at your turfs. Thank you. Thank you. That made me feel so good. And I loved it also when the what is it they use for this electronic surveying and getting levels and things like that. The battery went, and I could get the dumpy level out and tell them, how do you do it without electricity? You can survey, without electricity. It's done. You write down the numbers, you take the one away from another, and you add them on. So.
The reality of the size of the assemblage that we have for Barrow Clun is it's not that extensive, is it?
No, overall, it's good.
But we're not talking
manageable.
It's manageable.
Oh, it's very manageable. Yeah,
it's very manageable. And also, if you've got like Collingwood juices or whatever, it'd be a good thing to be able to do the see the comparisons between the two.
Yeah.
And everything's drawn now as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really that actually is what is absolutely critical when you get into the weaponry, you get into the shield bosses and the spearheads, because as I say, you're sort of transforming the rusty object you've got in front of me into an idealised object, and you're trying to do it as close as you possibly can. But the way I find I do it is you get those drawings and you literally measure on in pencil, the measurements you got and write them all in, because the problem with these iron things, every time you pick it up, another bit drops off it, or something like that. It's also the case that the drawing, however objective a draftsperson tries to be, they are going to give their honest impression of what they've got in front of them. It's going to be a diagram. Exactly, and that's what you have to take as your data for those. So those drawings are really valuable for.
The X-rays as well, but the
yes, yeah. Actually, X-rays jump a little bit in terms of size. They give you, the photograph can't lie, but it sort of yes.
Mine's working at the minute. You're trying to figure out how you're going to get Alice Roberts involved in this, aren't you?
Is that for the camera?
Yes.
But a fair point.
Yes.
I'm on the phone now.
Yes.
But if you look at Collingbourne, Deuces, Tidworth, Bullfairs and Barrow Clun, logically, it's actually quite a tight grouping, yet if it's still extant, the Bulford, Tidworth, there is a local difference, isn't there? And at least the distribution of where the grave goods are, the knife carriers. So, within a few miles, there's the crow flies.
Well, that would be good. I know Simon Cleggett was saying he had to go to whoever the developer is, or the client in that respect. Oh, is it? Oh, well, that should be all right then. Yeah. Good. Right, that's sorted then. Yeah. But it's just a matter of getting the stuff that, as the stuff feeds through. But certainly for an initial start, we can start with Collingbourne, or whatever. So it'll take quite a while, I think, to go through the typology, and it may be some people somebody really keen on the beads, say, right, there you are, have a shot at the beads. Here's Brugman, here's the beads. How do they match up? But, you know, or I actually, in my PhD, I did a lot of work on a particular object type. And the awful thing is, every time someone is found, somebody comes back to you and says, look, here's another interesting, you're utterly sick to death of the rotten things, you know, and you've done them and you want to move on to something else. But, you know, that's it. You know, there are lots of options, you know, for people. And I'd say at the typologies, you know, if people did want to sort of say, you know, really work on the shield bosses or something like that, that's definitely something that would be possible. It's genuinely interesting looking at all the shield fittings and seeing how they fit, they go back together into the artifact that was used. The really extraordinary thing about these shields that they've got with all of those bosses is they were tiny little things. You know, they seem to have been, you know, about, you know, 15 inches across. They're very, very small and light things indeed. But, you know, well made in terms, you know, you can identify the wood, you can see that they've got hide coverings and so on. There's all sorts of things you find out about them. Yeah, yeah. You're into reconstructing and experimental arguing?
I trained as a blacksmith, so I quite
enjoy
remaking things.
Great. Well, that's good. Well, I know, you know, sort of Alan here is sort of, you know, sort of into sort of making the beads. We've got a guy at Cardiff who I believe is ex-army himself, but he's very much into sort of bone and antler work. Makes bone combs and is trying to reconstruct the tools. He's much more Viking period than this period, but you know.
Thinking of what you said about the shields and about being that size.
Yeah.
Specifically that sort of size, I would have thought that would be more of a defensive weapon.
Yeah, that you know, they think.
With them,
yeah.
That would be quite a thing to just.
It's a punching. Yeah. You know, they you know, they almost certainly were punching in them. Yeah. Interestingly, something also that we hardly ever find we've got. I'll tell you all about this, and you'll probably be interested in we've got these big lake deposits of weapons from Denmark from the 2nd century through to the 5th century, and this is clearly the equipment of an army that's been defeated in battle. You can really see you've got the cuts on the weapons and everything, and at that point the typical armament for a man is you're going to have 2 spears. You've got a throwing spear that's got barbed head, you know, very long, narrow point and a barbed head. And that is being thrown, you know, if it hits one of your opponents, then great, but even if it just lodges in a shield, that's almost just as good, because if you've got a shield with a big spear sort of sticking in front of it, you can't believe that shield is pulled down and you presumably sent straight to the back to go back and get yourself another shield and come up into the shield wall again. After that, we're just not finding any throwing spears. So it looks, you know, the battle tactics have moved away from what we've got prior to this particular period, and we probably are looking at much more relatively light skirmishing really is going on. These shields just aren't big enough to form a shield wall.
So not the shield wall thing, which is every program you've.
Yeah, no, they're just too small.
Yeah, so.
Yeah. I mean, the Battle of Hastings, yeah, definitely there was a shield wall there, but they've got these big kite-shaped shields. They're standing up against cavalry, charging up the hill at them. You know, they were doing that, but these.
Later on, when they eventually did start bringing in the different versions of shields, depending on what sort of battles, you had your light and heavy cavalry.
That's going on sort of well into the beyond the Norman conquest when that happens, but certainly interesting, although the Saxons at the Battle of Hastings still don't seem to have developed any sort of real cavalry. There's been sort of questions about it, but it seems to be very minor. They used horses to ride to and from battles and so on, but breeding the big heavy war horses doesn't really seem to have been going on, and yet they clearly knew how to face a cavalry charge, you know, and you know they had the shields, the Norman style of shields, to be able to defend themselves with too. So, yeah, I'm interested. Right. Well, thank you all very, very much indeed.